Hi, Eugene.
Hello,
Welcome,
Anna. Good to see you.
welcome. I'm really happy to have this podcast recording with you because we've been in touch for years now and we haven't talked a lot about our professional lives, even though we keep talking about it on LinkedIn. But somehow we stayed connected throughout the years. We met in Belgium in some forest. There is this very beautiful forest in Belgium with bluebells, and we met there, and it was very random, but we kind of stayed connected, kept talking. Every few months, we check in with each other. And as I wanted to have these conversations with people from all over the globe, living in all different places and their migration journey, I thought it would be really cool to talk to Eugene as well because your life story is so fascinating, very beautiful, very colorful, full of experiences. You're an American who is now living in Hong Kong, but I know that it's even more complex than that. You've been living in different places throughout the years. So maybe to get us started, you can tell us your first day or first week of your migration journey, and you can bring us as much back as you want.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on the podcast, Anna. And indeed, we did meet in funny circumstances in a forest in Belgium. It wasn't as dark or crazy as it sounds. It was a trip and it was a fun trip. We had other friends there, took the bus not too far from Brussels, so it was a good time. It is an interesting story, of course, and there is a lot to go through. For the sake of time, we'll try to keep it condensed in a way. Some of the things I can share is that I grew up very internationally. I traveled a lot, and especially with this current job that I was doing, I got to travel a lot and see a lot of different parts of the world and experience people's lives, especially expatriates who live and work abroad. But I myself am currently an expat, like you said. That's right. I was raised in the U.S. from the West Coast in the state of Washington, city of Seattle. And I sort of fell in love with migrants and migrating and global international affairs at a very early young age. And I myself went through a couple of these migration stories, so to speak. So, for example, one of the things I did was I studied abroad in two different countries when I was studying at the University of Washington. And so that involved a little bit of this migration that we're talking about. And my first experience was in Denmark. That was a very nice place, but at the time, there was a couple of political issues happening in the country. Things like even getting my residence permit was a little bit of an issue. Even though I still love Denmark and I have the utmost respect for the Danish people in the country, it was a little bit tough to navigate. There was a little bit of difficulty due to, I believe, governmental policies at the time. My permit got lost in the mail or something like that, so I never actually received it. That was one of my first experiences with, let's say, issues when you're migrating, right? Because you do need your document, absolutely. My second experience was in Canada. So even though the US and Canada are very similar, we're neighbors and we're friends and all of those things, that was a completely different immigration story. Again, it was temporary, so it wasn't a permanent migration. It was just to study abroad as well. But that was a bit of an interesting experience because a lot of folks, I imagine, especially in European countries, such as where you are now, Anna, probably do cross-border travel a lot, and things like the Schengen zone allows for free cross-border travel for economic purposes. The US and Canada don't have exactly the same thing, but something similar. The way I was able to get all of my documents sorted out there was quite different than it was in Denmark, than it was in the EU. I didn't need a visa, luckily for me as an American, but I did have to provide a whole bunch of other documents. That was a bit of an issue with itself in order to open a bank account in Canada. And by the way, I was living in Ontario, in the capital, Ottawa, the province of Ontario. And there they needed certain documents to open a bank account or to get some of those other services like health insurance. So that was a little bit different as well. That was another type of lesson that I learned. A few years after graduating and receiving my education, I was able to migrate on over to Belgium, which is where I met you. That was also an interesting experience, going back to Europe, going back to the EU, but in a very different capacity. I don't know if you remember, I was working for the European Parliament. That was a specific program for non-EU citizens because I was working on transatlantic relations. and strengthening the ties between the EU and the United States and North America overall. I was allowed to work and do this program. And that came with another set of interesting rules because Belgium works very differently from these other places that I mentioned that I have experience in, including its rental clauses. Because finding a place was difficult. It was very competitive to find a good place to live within Brussels. I'm sure you can relate as well. And signing contracts and rental agreements is a completely different process as well. I had to learn about that. Apparently, there's like this 3, 6, 9 year contract you can sign, and I had to look for a sublet, and that was a little bit difficult to achieve. Not to mention there's a bit of a language barrier if you don't speak French or Dutch. That came with a whole bunch of other lessons, and that brings me to today, which is after Brussels I moved to the US city of Boston. I found a job there. And after 4 years there, I was relocated to Hong Kong, which is where I currently am, which is where I currently live. That I have a lot of stories to share with you because it also came with a lot of challenges, and it's a new continent for me. I never lived in Asia before this, and this is my first time living out here. There's a lot of great things about it. There's a lot of wonderful opportunities and people that I've met, but it also comes with its challenges, and perhaps we'll talk about them throughout the podcast. But I can tell you one of the most difficult things was getting my wife over here. This was happening all at the height of the pandemic. Maybe you're aware that Hong Kong had very strict anti-epidemic, anti-pandemic measures. So there was strong quarantine measures, 21 days in a hotel. And pre-vaccine people had to do quarantine at home. It was tracked with a bracelet, and you have to present a lot of documents before arriving, such as negative PCR tests or your residency, and that comes with letters from your employer and all of these things. The bureaucracy of migrating or all of this paperwork, being able to collect it and submit it on time to the right person, to the right place, that was a headache. And unfortunately, my wife fell through the cracks of the system. And what ended up happening was that she had to spend 2 weeks at the international airport in Seoul, South Korea, to do her quarantine. It was a very terrible time for her getting over here. That's, I guess, her migrant story, but that's definitely affected me.
First of all, it's insane what you're talking about the experience with your wife. I'd never heard about it. I knew that Asia was very strict. I had a few friends with whom I talked during the pandemic about their experience. Some of them got stuck, some of them were not able to leave, and it was quite a big deal. But this is even crazier than I thought. And she's American as well, or did her nationality or any other things influence that decision?
A little bit, yes, but not about getting the documents to Hong Kong. She's on her way to becoming American, but her citizenship at the time was Mexican. When she was flying, this was August 2020, so sort of right in the middle of the pandemic, but still early on. A lot of countries announced border closures, and our plan, which was 100% legal and supported by my employer and everybody else, was she would enter as a tourist, and as a Mexican citizen, she's allowed to stay 90 days visa-free for tourism in Hong Kong, just as are Americans, just as a few other nationalities here. It's just, that's how it works, 90 days. Within those 90 days, you convert your visa status and you allow the authorities to grant you permission to stay, or whatever the official title is. It's actually dependent visa. So I'm the worker and she would be the dependent, right? Depending on me in a way. Then you go to, for example, Macau for a day trip. Macau is not far from Hong Kong. It's an hour boat ride. Very popular with gamblers from China. It's just a big casino. It's almost like Las Vegas, but in China. You go there for a day, you come back in, and you sort of reset your status. Now you're no longer a tourist. Now you're a dependent. And that was our whole plan from the very beginning. We already had our marriage certificate and everything ready to go. We turned it in. And because of everything that happened, right? Nobody planned for the pandemic. It just happened. Everything was delayed. But she already put in, for example, her resignation at work in Boston. We gave up our apartment because now I was living in Hong Kong. All I had to do was just bring her over here. So we had no place to live. She had no place to work. And at the time, it was kind of like, well, she has only a few more days to leave the U.S. and that's that. And the thing with immigration, as you very well know, is that these external factors like pandemics or whatever's happening in the world not always affect immigration rules. People sometimes get on planes and then the plane has to return, but then it's a big headache for everyone because they were stamped out. So are they going to get back in? Do they have to get stamped again? I don't know. People need visas. Same thing with this situation. They didn't know what could happen. So my wife had to leave the US, but then now they're saying like, oh, hang on, but she's not allowed to enter. But then what happened was it was actually the airline we were flying with, or she was flying with, it was their fault. And what happened was the person checking her in found inaccurate information, and she didn't know that spouses of residents are allowed in Hong Kong. Because like I mentioned, at the time, Hong Kong stopped allowing tourists in, and basically all other travel, with the exception of residents, diplomats, and then, I don't know, special cases or whatever. So she would fall under residents because she's the wife of a resident already. Family's included in that rule.
Yes.
But the person who would just happened to check her in that day, it was just really bad luck, didn't know this. And so she didn't allow her to board the airplane. But at the same time, what added to the complexity of this, so that's one thing, right? It's like, okay, well, we proved it to somebody else that the Hong Kong government allows spouses. And we also showed that on Hong Kong national flag carrier, which is like the main airline here, which is called Cathay Pacific. On their rules online, it said that it's possible. Of course, the only exception to this rule are spouses and direct family of dependents. But that's an airline. Fine. We show it on the Hong Kong Immigration Department website. Same thing. They say, of course, spouses are allowed. But this person didn't want to believe it, didn't let her check in. Wow. To add to the complexity of all this, Hong Kong at the time required a negative PCR test. We're all familiar now with the polymerase chain reaction tests, but back then, this was pre-vaccine, so everyone was on edge, everything was super stressful and unknown. And getting a PCR test in the US was hard, so my wife had to scour the internet and like figure out which lab can send me a test. Then I have to send it back. Then I get my results. Does it match up? Will Hong Kong accept this? Stressful time for her and for me. And then we finally found something. They did the test, and then Hong Kong required, and I don't exactly remember, it was either 72 hours in advance or 48 hours, one of those two. So she finally matches everything up. She gets the result, negative. Phew, okay, doesn't have COVID, good, can get on the plane at least, has all her documents, has the marriage certificate, has all of this stuff, comes up to the check-in stand, and the lady there just says, no, not allowed on. And so it was an airline mistake. But because the clock is running out on the test and the fact that she needs to leave the U.S., she's no longer able to extend her stay because she resigned from her job, right? That's it, she needs to move on. She took another flight. And that one went, she was in Seattle at the time. So Seattle, Seoul, Hong Kong. She gets on that flight, gets off in Seoul, sees the gate to Hong Kong, stops there, and they keep checking her documents, they keep checking it over. And because the original flight that she was going to take was, let's say at like 10 a.m., we matched all of this up. If she was to land in Hong Kong, it would have been exactly just the rule. So under 72 hours or under 48 hours, whatever it was. But because the next flight left 2 hours later, so not at 10, but at 12, by the time she got to Seoul, that COVID test was 1 or 2 hours after the cutoff time. And so they're telling her, we can't let you on the plane. You don't have a negative valid PCR test. And of course it's BS because she didn't catch it on the plane. She's not coughing. She can do it again. But there's no tests that are being sold in the transit area. She just kind of got stuck there, basically. She had no clue what to do. She was freaking out. They weren't very helpful at all. Nobody knew anything. Nobody could do anything. And you couldn't even like go and help her out somehow because everything's closed off. Korea was going through the same thing as everybody else, and they also closed everything to tourism. If you enter as a tourist, then you have to do 2 weeks quarantine. So she couldn't leave and enter the city of Seoul, and that was illegal anyway, just because there's no tourism at that time. She basically had to clear her status as being COVID-free, but for 2 weeks in the Seoul International Airport. So that was terrible. Luckily, she found a hotel, so she was able to at least sleep in a bed. But just all the emotional trauma and all the distress she had to go through was too much. Then, upon arrival to Hong Kong, she did her 2 weeks there. She had to do 2 weeks at home here. So, all in all, my wife lost 4 weeks of her life, basically a month, just trying to get over to Hong Kong. That is a hell of a migration story right there. Poor thing went through a lot. Yeah, no, she really suffered. Eventually, things finally looked up. It all worked out. She was here. We were finally reunited. And things were looking bleak here because there were a lot of restrictions. As of late last year, early this year, things have opened up again. And I think everyone's past the pandemic. So we've actually been traveling now finally. And we were able to, calm things down. But getting over here was the big issue. That was it. And on top of that, it didn't help that they were delaying the visa. And if I didn't look into it myself, I personally had to call, it's called the Immigration Tower. I had to deal with them directly. And I had to call and not make a scene, but just be like, guys, come on, what's going on? If you can just please explain what's happening and just really push for it, then the visa probably would have even taken longer. Long story short, it took a really long time. And then she had to go through this exercise. Had a good ending, had a good happy ending.
Well, I'm happy to hear that it's ended in a good note in a sense, but it is indeed horrible. And you're right, I haven't thought much about the migration experience during this COVID time because I know how certain countries work. Where I lived in Belgium, lived in Italy, here in Bulgaria, and fortunately I didn't have to endure almost anything about it. The only thing I think was the issue with that was I needed to renew my passport in Ukraine, and I went there just before COVID. So it was the same day as everything globally started shutting off as I came back from Ukraine to Bulgaria.
Nice.
Here, and I was put in quarantine for 2 weeks right away. And I basically needed to come back to Ukraine maybe within a month or two to pick up my passport because they don't do it. I know like certain countries like New Zealand, they can even ship you the passport and you can order it on the internet, which is bizarre for me. But I had to come back to Ukraine. What happened is that I obviously was not able to go anywhere. And for months and months, I think I came back over half a year after, I think, or maybe even later, I'm not sure. I had someone call and verify for how long they would keep this passports, and they said a year. So like, okay, within a year, I needed to come back, and I did. But it was like crazy. It was really insane. Exactly. That for sure, that's how I was in terms of bureaucracy affected by COVID, because I needed to renew my external passports. For that, I needed the internal one and all this kind of stuff. The way I got my permit back in Belgium when it was still pre-COVID and everything, it was also some kind of bizarre story. As a family member, I had this orange card. It looks very 20th century. Your photo is clipped on it. You keep it for 6 months. You can't leave the country at all. I suppose people could leave it, like they take a bus or something. You can go to Amsterdam, but I didn't want to risk it. So 6 months in Belgium without moving anywhere, it is quite intense because Belgium is so small. And in the end, I come back 6 months in, and the guy who has been basically walking me through everything for months and months, we've talked about all the process and everything, he helped a lot. He calls the whoever because he didn't see anything in his system, right? I waited for 6 months, I prepared everything. My friend wrote a letter, wrote it in Dutch, explaining everything. There was a lot of paperwork in it, like just literally a lot of paper in this case, and they lost it somewhere. It never arrived or whatever, and the guy just like hangs on, and he's telling me, okay, I know that this is a real case, it's fine, so I will grant it to you. Come back in 3 days, we'll take the photo and everything. It's just insane to me because he could have as easily told me, no, it's a no, we didn't get it, you need to wait another 6 months. It was crazy. Talking about bureaucracy of migrating, actually, yes, it is such a pain in the butt. And you might be from a country like me where I don't have as many rights as other people who have the same need, they move to a different country. Or it can be what happened to your wife and you can't control anything. It's just this bizarre, weird experience that you have. Life happens to you and you just have to like, okay, I gotta get out of it somehow. I don't know how.
Yeah, exactly.
And in line of your work, because I understand that you also work with migrants, expats, it's also probably a lot of such cases. Do you have any like more
Yes.
crazy stories like that from
Oh,
other
yeah,
people?
plenty. Plenty. Working in global mobility, there's always a lot of crazy stuff going on. And obviously, the pandemic also contributed to that. There were workers, I can tell you, that were stuck in countries because they all of a sudden closed off their borders and then they were on their way to another assignment where they were going to come home. Our clients and companies would have to charter specific planes. That's extra costs. But then you would have to deal with the bureaucratic part, which is talking to the government and trying to explain, hey, of course we want to follow the rules, but then these people were already on their way when everything went down. Because it was sort of all so sudden, March 2020, that things really started closing down. And because people don't have experience with this, last time there was a pandemic, it was literally 100 years before that, right? At the end of World War One, the Spanish flu. So those lessons, I guess, weren't really taught. People haven't experienced that. There were many, many crazy stories like that. Something that comes to mind is that a lot of companies in my line of work, I can tell you, they paused any sort of assignments for at least 2020. They didn't want to leave people stranded, for example. They didn't want their employees to be stuck somewhere at an assignment at a location that is perhaps a difficult one, like a hardship location, as we call it in the biz. They didn't want them to keep experiencing that. Some people wanted to stay, for example, and extend their stay, so they would have to request visa extensions, right? Still, there was work to be done. Bureaucracy got in the way. People would have to explain what's the reasoning behind you wanting to stay. And so they said, it's not really my choice. It's because the borders are closed. I can't get home. There's just no direct flights. And governments don't really want to hear that. They want to hear legitimate reasons, so to say. But this was a legitimate reason. And so this whole time really came with a lot of lessons that even in these extreme or emergency times, these are the legitimate reasons. Someone has to stay here, not because they necessarily want to or want to take advantage of some tax treaty, therefore they're extending their stay. Not at all. It's because countries and governments were just not used, didn't even have rules in place for such situations. So this is like a big lesson that I think a lot of people in our industry walked away with, which is that there's just things that are not in place. And global mobility's role is to be reactive, is to be quick, is to be able to look out after its people and know what to do. Always have a contingency plan or a backup plan. This was a talking point for my whole industry for the past 3 years, basically, and especially that first year in 2021, let's say, not after the pandemic, but after the closing of borders, people were thinking, well, how do we react to something like this again if it was to happen? So these type of lessons, trying to figure out how to react, what to do, to have a plan ready, to make sure that if your employees are traveling on the company dime, then there is this type of support in case something like this happens again. Maybe you've heard a prediction by Bill Gates and other more famous people who are saying these type of occurrences in the future might be happening more often. So not like 100 years apart, but fewer breaks in between. It's good to be prepared. It's good to know what's coming, and it's good to know how to react to take care of your people. But global mobility was heavily affected, Anna, during this time. Absolutely. People weren't moving. Companies were shutting down its locations elsewhere, right? If, for example, your employer wants to move you from Bulgaria, let's say, to Morocco, and they want to know, well, what's going on over there? Like, what's the cost of living like?
Mm.
How much are the houses? How much are the apartments? If you have children, then which school should they go to? Do they want to do the French language school? Do they want to do the English or Arabic language school? So all of this stuff, this is what we do. This is what we provide the data. And because that wasn't happening now, because everybody shut down their borders and everyone was just waiting it out, this industry kind of took a big hit, because this is what we live on. This is
Yeah.
what we thrive on. People moving, companies moving people. So slowly that's been picking back up. This year's looking much better. And ever since the vaccine came out and countries started opening up their borders, things slowly picked back up. But it's not to pre-pandemic levels. And of course, this industry has also changed over the years, just because things like remote offices or even
Mm.
remote working, that's become a very popular topic, are possible now. The idea of sending your traditional expat with a family abroad is becoming just less common.
This brings me to conversation point that we can discuss together is the future of migration. Maybe in this
Hmm.
specific case, it is relocation for work, it is expatriation, which usually what it means, right?
Hmm.
Last week, I recorded a podcast which I just released today with my friend from Iran. And we also
Ooh,
talked
nice.
about migration it's actually a point that was brought up to me as well, something to consider. Is migration related to climate crisis and
Hmm.
how the future will also be about that? And what
Yes.
you're saying about this, you probably know the concept of black swans and
Hmm.
anti-fragility. This is exactly what you're talking about. For us
Yep.
to be ready for something that we don't know what it is, to, in a sense, try to be somehow anti-fragile, to be able to bounce back from any challenge instead of letting this challenge break us or becoming too hard in face of this challenge, like water, I suppose, to adapt,
Hmm.
to keep going. That's how I see it. So what do you think could be our future? Because you already mentioned these occurrences, these black swans, these unpredictable, unforeseen situations might happen. How will our future of migration be?
That's a really good question, and it comes with so many different answers that are possibilities, right? Because so many things can happen, and with this pandemic, we've seen not everyone is ready, not everyone has a quick response to it. You really don't know. But I can tell you also from my professional perspective, or at least what I was doing with global mobility, there's a couple of things that have changed or are changing that industry, which I think indirectly also affects migration. Let me share these two things. Number one is, and you alluded to this already, it was the climate issue. The fact that there is climate change happening. And recently, I think it was just a few days ago, was the hottest day recorded on record since recordings ever started, and I think that was July 3rd. So temperatures are going up. But what a lot of countries are doing and a lot of companies is that they want to cut back on things like travel. They want to cut back on carbon emissions and they don't want to contribute to a lot of the flights that are happening. So what does that mean? If you're a company that's based, let's say, in Australia and you have a lot of work that is being done in Southern Africa or in South America, there's just no way you can get there without flying, because I mean Australia is an island, right? It's all the way out there. So when it comes to migration and migration stories, then you might see a little bit less of it, or at least less of these traditional expats out there, because people are conscious about it and companies are conscious. They do want to cut back on things like carbon emissions and they don't want to contribute to the ongoing climate problem. They rather perhaps keep workers either remotely somewhere else, or they'll have their local ones just do work at home and they'll mix with their offices abroad in a different way. We have seen this become a topic of conversation, sustainability, and the whole concept of ESG, and E is for environment as well as sustainability. Just these green movements in general, that's something we've seen. The traditional migrant of, let's say, taking a plane somewhere, I think that will be radically different in the future. Now, of course, I'm not talking about the people who are fleeing from war or from other difficult countries, such as you see boats crossing the Mediterranean to the shores of Southern Europe. That might still be happening because desperate times call for desperate measures. People want to escape their difficulties, so they'll do it. In the North American side, you see caravans of people just walking. That's like your completely traditional way of migration, literally just walking over to a new place. Maybe you've heard about this caravan from Honduras that's going via Mexico to the United States. Stuff like that perhaps will still happen, but that's more of a socioeconomic problem as well, I would say. There's a lot of factors that cause those. But migration, when it comes due to employment or due to economic migration, people who want to find a better opportunity elsewhere or fly somewhere else. This perhaps you'll see less of just because people are getting stricter on flights. It's probably not in the interest of airlines, right? They do want to keep flying, but if there's going to be less demand, then there's going to be less supply as well. That's the number one thing, the environmental concern and climate change and the reaction to that. The other thing is what the pandemic has taught a lot of companies is that remote work is possible. So when it is a traditional case, let's say back from the early 2000s, where an expat would be asked to move from one country to another. It's to do the job over there because those skills are required. This is why that person was moved. But now what you're seeing is people can communicate with their coworkers via some sort of platform, whether it's Teams or Skype or Zoom or whatever people were using. And some of those jobs that people thought have to be done on the ground are no longer needed to be done on the ground. They could be done remotely. And a lot of like side services, as I call them, have started popping up. What I mean by that is, you know how every country has its own tax jurisdiction and regulations, right? So whatever you pay in Bulgaria is not the same amount you would pay in Belgium, right? But there perhaps is a treaty or some sort of agreement where a Belgian can work in Bulgaria and vice versa, or whatever, right? So that's just an example. But a country doesn't have that with every single country, which means this created this spot where companies have come in and they're called employers of record, or EOR for short. And these are companies that help other companies who don't have a presence in a certain jurisdiction employ people, and they're able to do their work remotely from that one particular place. I'm simplifying it. There's a lot more to it, but let's just say that's the gist of it. So you'll see these remote assignments, and that's also what we've been seeing in our industry is the rise of remote assignments and online assignments, or virtual assignments. That's another name for them. So someone is still physically based, let's say maybe still in Boston, but they'll be doing the work that is actually meant for the Hong Kong office. Maybe they'll have to adjust their hours. There's a 12-hour time difference, by the way. So for example, that person in Boston will have to work nights to accommodate for the Hong Kong schedule, right? But the fact that that assignment exists and you don't have to bring the person over, that's something we're seeing a lot more of. That kind of cuts the migration part out of it completely. For some that's good, for some that's bad, because, you know, an experience like working abroad can be very, very fulfilling and very interesting and character and life building. But for others, and for a company, perhaps you're also saving on costs, or you're not contributing to the environmental impact. There's different ways of looking at this, and I think that all of these migration stories that we talked about could be affected by these two things that we've observed in at least this industry.
Of course, it's a huge stretch to say it like this, but do you believe that the availability of these solutions in the future even more would actually help people where they are? You know how they say,
Ooh, that is...
like, let's help people where they are, which is, it's a rhetoric which is too complex to just say yes or no, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. It is complex. It's hard to say. It's not as black and white, right? Because I do understand the concept of meeting people where they are or helping them where they are. But then what's funny to me is that sometimes where you are is part of the problem. So sometimes if you do switch the location, then maybe things start flowing better. Maybe you see something else. You see a different perspective. It's that change of scenery that you really needed. So maybe it's more case by case, Anna. In this situation, maybe it's like for some people, yeah, for sure, offering the chance to work remotely, but from their home, your boss is over there somewhere else. Maybe that's what they need, and that's good. But for somebody else, they really actually need to do the whole migration process or the whole expatriate relocation to really feel like they're contributing to something and doing the work and being productive. As it was demonstrated throughout the pandemic as well, some people love working from home, some people don't. They absolutely hate it. And productivity, they always try to measure productivity. Where are you more productive, at home or in the office? At home or in the office? I don't think there was like a clear answer for anybody. Some people are more productive in the office. They thrive in the fact that other conversations are happening and the chair is uncomfortable and the temperature's off and they can focus. But for others, maybe they'd rather be at home because their child's there or their dog and they want to take care of them. And then they sit down at some non-traditional time, like 2 p.m., let's say, and start answering emails, and they're more productive that way. It just comes down to the individual. I understand it's hard to make a policy around that if you need one solid policy, but perhaps talking to the collective, trying to figure out what's your company really trying to achieve, work-life balance or just making people come to the office. Long story short, or I guess as I like to say, long story long, and to answer your question, maybe it's up to the person, up to the case.
Yes, it's also my favorite answer, even though I know it's not simplifying anything for anyone.
I know, right? That's true.
That's how I think the world will become increasingly more complex, and I'm very fascinated and curious to see this whole conversation of migration, remote work. Also, as a freelancer myself, you're now competing with the whole world, but in the end, you're also building something of your own, which is completely different from anyone in the world. It's so complex. That's the word that I have in mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I completely agree with you. It is complex, and I guess having these conversations is the probably the first step to trying to start answering these questions, right?
Hmm.
Because yeah, like you said, we're not making it easier for anyone, but to start thinking about it, to start talking about it, this is probably on the way to the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. I also had a question for you, which probably will open a whole new Pandora box. It is where you are currently and what we talked about in terms of the politics changing the environment you're in. I don't know if you ever thought to stay in Hong Kong for a really long time, or maybe to have it as your actual, next home, and not go into much into details of what is happening right now. But how do you think we can navigate this external world again kind of happening to our experience? And in certain ways, yes, we as expats, as migrants, probably are a bit more free to pick our bags and go again somewhere else than the locals, but still we are moving somewhere with a certain hope or certain maybe expectation. This will be our next home, right?
Hmm.
And then things like what's happening right now in Hong Kong are happening, which is not a crisis like in other parts of the world where you really need to flee tonight, but
Hmm.
it still doesn't make you feel, I don't know, safe.
Yeah, yeah, like you said, Pandora's box, so many complicated issues, but I'll try to condense it as well. You're right in that when we first moved here, we were thinking of it, this is going to be our new home. So, of course, everything was positive and everything was open. We were open to new experiences, new things to try. You know, the cuisine's very different, so we gave that a try. A lot of different things. The activities, for example, a lot of Hong Kongers love to hike. Hiking is not something we particularly like doing, but we learned a lot about it here. I've also gotten into racket sports because Hong Kongers love to play tennis and badminton. So I've gotten big into that. Back in the US, I was playing football or like American football, big team sports with a big field. But here, limited space, less fields like that. So the situation here is quite complicated. Like you said, there's no active war going on, for example. So it's not like that. And there's a lot of happy people who do enjoy it for everything that it is. That's wonderful. It's changed a bit ever since certain laws were passed earlier this decade. And there were protests that were happening in 2019 that leading up to this one particular rule or law that was passed. And a lot of folks ended up leaving either partially due to it or maybe even other reasons. But people did leave. And we're talking about local people as well. If you remember, I mentioned this, Hong Kong was a colony of the United Kingdom until 1997 when the handover happened, as it's called. And that was on July 1st. We celebrated that on Saturday, by the way, this past Saturday. So 26 years of being given back to mainland China. Since 1997, a couple of things have changed, and there was an agreement that was in place. And to some people, it seems like that agreement was broken. A couple of the rules changed and things kind of sped up quickly. And that's where these 2019 student protests happened. Those who lived in Hong Kong pre 1997 were able to apply for something called the BNO, British National Overseas Passport. That basically meant that as you were living in Hong Kong, you were a subject of the United Kingdom of Her Majesty. It's not citizenship, it's just the national passport. So the rules are a little bit different. I don't know if they can vote like in elections, and I believe they can live in the United Kingdom, but it just comes with certain restrictions. Those who had it, a lot of folks ended up leaving, and so they moved to the UK looking for a different type of experience, a different home, different rules. Others who had ties either to North America, such as Canada or the United States or Australia, ended up moving to those places. And you could really see it and feel it in the city. It feels like there's less people. At its height, there was almost 8 million people in Hong Kong, and now it feels like there's a little bit less. And so you can feel it, you can see it. Housing prices have also gone down. But in the middle of earlier this decade, so in like 2021, 2022, expatriates started leaving as well. this was kind of like a sign to us that, oh no, perhaps Hong Kong isn't the place we'll choose to make a life or stay for a long time. We love everything about it. It comes with its own challenges, like I mentioned, of course, but we met and made good friends. We made a lot of interesting discoveries here as well. We'd like to stay, but a lot of people did end up leaving. And again, for various reasons, contracts ended, there you go, or like borders open, they were meaning to go. But a lot ended up leaving because of some of these difficulties. Also in 2022, and I don't know if I told you, there was a plan at the beginning of the year to send anybody who tests positive with the COVID virus to something called Penny's Bay, which was a camp out next to the airport where you would stay for 2 weeks until you clear the virus out of your system, you test negative again. And they were going to go building by building in all of Hong Kong and test everybody. And whoever was positive would be sent there. Now, that's crazy. Like I mentioned, almost 7.5 million people would have to be tested. But at the same time, the virus really started taking off. It really spread. So they just scrapped the idea. But when it was announced, the fear that, oh no, if you test positive, you have to go somewhere else, that drove a lot of people out. And if they were looking for that one final reason to be like, should I leave Hong Kong or should I stay? That was it. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back. I remember seeing an article that said something like 200,000 expatriates left in 2022. And 200,000 is a sizable number, right? But that's the population of a city somewhere in Europe, for example. A whole city just got up and left because they didn't want to put up with these type of rules. But luckily, I can tell you that did not go down because everybody basically got it and everybody cleared it at home, and they didn't want to spread it even more by taxiing people around, right? Like putting all of them on a bus and then driving them out there to the airport and then driving them back. It wasn't the best approach, but that was the plan. It didn't happen, and then the city started opening up. Once, everybody passed through the virus, you experience it, you get it, and that's it. You get better and you move on. Then things started to get better. But for those few months, I can tell you, it was scary. The supermarkets were empty. People were panic buying. Fruits and veggies basically non-existent. People just sold out immediately. And there was fear that the authorities would separate children from parents because they did do that earlier. And so people didn't want to have the virus and then have their child be sick with the virus, but somewhere else where you can't even reach them because they wanted complete isolation, like one person per room. So that scared a lot of folks. And especially I can tell you some of the Americans I met here, other Americans abroad, that was to them was crazy because in the US, even though maybe it wasn't the best response in the world to the virus, they weren't doing that in the US.
Can't even imagine someone trying to do it here in Bulgaria with the feeling of so many people and how they behaved with COVID. You can almost say, like, obviously sarcastically, there was no COVID in Bulgaria because people would have the masks on their chins. And because they didn't measure the COVID cases during the weekend, then the stats were, there is less COVID on the weekend. And it's so bizarre. Very weird. This quarantine that I had to do as I just landed back to Bulgaria, and I was very thorough with it. I didn't even go to take out the trash. But I know many people didn't care. There were stories like they may be tracking your phone, they know when you're out. But honestly, I don't think that people really had the resources to do all of that. And it was very weird. But I do have to say something, maybe coming back to the very beginning of our conversation on bureaucracy, that Bulgarian Migration Office, they kind of extended all of the expiring visas or the permits because people couldn't just go to renew them. So that happened, and that was good.
Oh, that's
that was
good.
Really, that really supported many people in these very critical situations.
That's good.
So the response, the knowing how to deal with situations for the future, even thinking through what can go wrong and try to be as prepared as possible for that. That is probably not the mentality that most of the world, of the population has. And hopefully that will change as well.
Exactly. No, I agree. Good on the Bulgarian government for being proactive, right? And just saying, hey, we'll extend it and that's that. You can't make it. Of course. That's good.
I took note of some of the lessons that you mentioned because this is also a conversation of the lessons learned. So coming back to being ready for the unforeseen things as much as possible. Obviously, that's why they're unforeseen, right? They happen and you don't know what to do, but having some kind of template of, okay, this is how we can behave in certain situations. This is just life on maybe bigger scale, right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or even in 1 hour, but with this readiness to act, to do something, we're not on autopilot. And also, very interesting conversation that we had that I really wanted to hear your opinion on, because you're just so knowledgeable. You have this wealth of knowledge and experience. Is what's the future for migration, for expatriation, for remote work? Very fascinating topic. I'm not sure we arrived to any solution, but we'll
Yeah,
see how the world reacts and builds on that. And I really
exactly.
hope that next place, or this place where you're at, is gonna be really the home, the way you want it. It is kind of a search that we all have, right? All of
Exactly.
us migrants, people who do this for the reasons of building a better life, maybe for
Hmm.
ourselves, which is more us. I hope one day we arrive to this place
I
where
hope
we
so
actually
too.
call it home, and this is what it is.
Exactly. I hope so too. That's a very positive note to finish on. And I agree. I hope so. I also hope for you, Anna, that if this isn't the place, then you will find it soon where you can be calm and restful and find that peace as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much, Eugene.